Welcome again to Hack Your Hazcom, where we dive into all things hazard communication. I'm pleased to introduce you to my guest, Sarah Henderson, who is the founder and principal environmental strategist at Henderson Solutions, which is a woman-owned firm specializing in hazardous materials management, regulatory compliance, and sustainable chemical life cycle solutions. With over 25 years of experience supporting military installations, federal agencies, and private industry, Sarah is a nationally recognized leader in OSHA HazCom compliance and digital innovation in environmental health and safety. She's truly passionate about initiatives designed to simplify chemical transparency through training, technology, and digital product passports. Her mission is to make hazardous communication clearer, smarter, and more proactive, whether it's through AI-driven apps, customized training programs, or her upcoming books on chemical life cycle management. Today's episode, we're going to focus on practical strategies, hard-earned insights, and her vision for the future of HazCom that every safety professional should hear. With that, welcome, Sarah. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Atanu. Thanks so much for that introduction and thanks for having me. Such a great concept here.
Great, great. Awesome. I'm glad you're with us today. So, let's get right into this. For people who don't always work in our industry in chemical management, can you explain to me in simple terms what a safety data sheet is and how it plays a role in the overall hazard communication process, and why do industry them?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for that question. Safety data sheets, I like to think of them as cheat sheets, basically, for any chemicals that you or your employees are utilizing in the workplace. They give you all of the information you need to use, store, transport, dispose of products and hazardous materials. So they really are just the roadmap to how to utilize hazardous materials in your business. What role do they play in hazard communication? There are 5 main elements to a hazard communication program. And the first one is an absolute inventory of everything that you have on site, safety data sheets that match that inventory, a written hazard communication plan, training on all of those elements, and then of course labeling, which those labels, everything is typically labeled when we have it, unless you're decanting it or separating it. Then you need to provide your own label. But safety data sheet is one of those 5 major elements of a complete hazard communication program. So it really is an important element.
And with that, those are certainly things that are regulatorily defined, right? So I would imagine these are country-specific formats. They have a certain set of information that has to go in them. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. These safety data sheets follow the OSHA hazard communication standard and the Global Hazard Communication Systems, or GHS, which is actually put out by the UNECE. So it's the Economic Commission, that beautiful purple book. So if you're doing business anywhere globally with hazardous materials, you have to produce a safety data sheet, but not only in the country that you're producing it, but for the countries where you're selling it, shipping it, marketing it, where it's being used. So yeah, it's a pretty definite document. Gives a lot of information. Everything's broken up by section, per country rules. A lot of information in there.
Yeah, and with that, I know with the sections that are mandated to be put in there, there's a lot of information. You have to keep your audience in mind, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later as we get through this. What kind of information should we be looking for in these SDSs?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're doing and where you're starting. I think certainly right up front, we want to know who the manufacturer is and what product we're working with, and where we can get any additional information if we need that from the manufacturer. But GHS is really designed so that it can be understood by anyone, even with a short education. So those pictograms are a great place to start in section 2 and are also on the label. One of those 9 diamonds that tell you what the main hazards are. And then also the hazard statements and the precautionary codes that also come on the label and within the safety data sheet Those are things that we really need to be looking at initially to understand what the immediate hazards are. But I would say that I spend a lot of my time diving into section 3, which is the ingredients section. So everybody wants to know what's in that product, what chemicals are in that product, and at what percentage. Really, I think those are probably the most initial and most commonly used elements of the safety data sheet.
Excellent. Great. And now, how has the role of the SDS evolved over the years, especially now with digital tools and software showing up on the scene?
Technology and AI, I think, could be game changers for our industry, but I think that it's not being adopted in the way that it could be. And I think it's important to look at the history of the safety data sheet to understand maybe why that's not happening. Think about in the 80s, right? We all of a sudden are telling manufacturers that they have to come up with a piece of paper that tells us all the hazards that are associated to the chemicals that we're buying from them. And imagine they're like, I got to do what? Like, how, what format, what information? And it wasn't really all that clear to them. They could do it in any format. They wrote it out, typewriter, fax machines. Now we've evolved to a place where safety data sheets are created with these massive software tools that they can be created for individual countries and that kind of information. And they're delivered in a PDF format via an email or via a system, right? So we've had this massive paradigm shift from a piece of paper to something that's electronic and in our face. And it's time for another shift to get that information out of binders and out of filing cabinets and onto digital devices where we can find these safety data sheets and find this information a lot more easily. But I think it's going to require a little bit of a paradigm shift. Everybody looks at a safety data sheet as a reactive product. We get it out when we get it in our eye or we spill it and we don't know what to do. But safety data sheets are really designed to be a proactive product. You look at them before you start using those products. And I think that AI can help with that by segregating some of the sections that we need, or very specific looking at overall inventories and helping us curate the training that we offer in our facilities so that they're very specific to the hazards that we have in our facilities, not every hazard that could possibly go wrong out there. So I think that the potential is there to have a very drastic change for our industry, but I think it's still coming. We're going to see safety data sheets coming not only in PDF, now we can get them in HTML, or we can get them in a JSON format or a CSV file, and we can segregate all the elements and index them, and we're no longer having people doing manual entry. So I really do believe that technology is a game changer, but we need a lot more adoption from industry.
Yeah, and I think the basic foundation to that too is the data that, even going back to when these were written on paper and we're relying on them in the 80s and 90s, and back when we didn't have a 16 section format. I like to tell people it was a wild west out there. This wild west of what data am I getting? I've seen SDSs out there, or MSDSs back then, material safety data sheets, where for the same product you could have maybe one double-sided page, right, versus 16 pages of the same, product. Where do you find the data there, and how is it trustworthy? I mean, again, just like you mentioned, AI is being trained on all human data that's out there, right? That includes this kind of stuff. I'm sure when they brought out these learning models and such, they had these old, 8-section format SDSs that had hardly anything on there, all the way on up to what we have today. I'm hoping that this AI can sort this stuff out, and because again, we're relying on it. These inherently could bring up biases and off what they call hallucinations, right, in the data. So we're hoping, this is another tool, but you've got to have the human element in here. The data has to be correct. Authors like myself, we have to rely on manufacturing data, and I'm sure we'll have to evolve with that and make sure that the data output with this tool, software tools, digital tools, etc., are coming out. They still need a human to review it. So I'm sure in that case, there's probably other challenges that you can probably see with companies in managing these SDSs effectively with these tools, what other approaches do they have, and challenges that companies face?
I think there are three major challenges that we're working with. I think the onus is on the people that are utilizing the safety data sheets and the products themselves to review those safety data sheets. Because I think you're right, a lot of times they're not right. People that have written them are sometimes the human resource officer or the tech that they hired for the summer, and it's just not a critical part of a small business or a small manufacturer's business to write an accurate safety data sheet. So the onus really is on us to make sure as the user that that information is there for us to utilize. And let me go back to your question on the biggest challenges. I would say one of the biggest challenges is making sure that you have a safety data sheet for every piece of inventory. Even if you're a small business, you have a lot of inventory. And making sure that when new inventory comes in, you're getting this new influx. Stuff has left and stuff has come back in. That is a huge challenge. But now with barcode technology, you can scan the barcodes of all of your inventory. Or if you don't have that kind of technology, right, you're just taking your inventory on a notebook, making sure you're getting in the manufacturer name, the item name, and the quantity that you have, right? Then you can go and find those safety data sheets. So I think that's the biggest challenge is making sure you're identifying accurately the inventory that you have. Then the influx comes in and then new regulations. Those things that are coming out there, the TSCA 6 regulations, where we're looking at 5 different chemicals basically every year, and TSCA and the EPA is going to regulate them in some way, right? They're either going to ban them, reduce an exposure level, or change a labeling requirement, and we don't know. And I think that one of the challenges is that the chemicals that we've looked at that have been maybe under risk assessment have been a little bit familiar to some of us EH&S professionals, right? We've all heard of tetrachloroethylene. We all watched a civil action, right? We know what it does. We've all heard of methylene chloride, asbestos, some of the other ones that have gone through those risk assessments. We know them and we can look for them. And we actually even know the products that they're in. And we're like, oh yeah, maybe I need an alternative for this, right? But those challenges are getting greater because the chemicals that are getting risk assessed are not ones that we all know anymore. The ones coming up are like 1,3-butadiene. What is that used in? Or NMP or PIP 313. What are these things, right? So they have these long chemical names that we're not familiar with, and we're going to have to identify them by CAS number. So now are you going to go through your entire inventory and look for everything by CAS number manually? Yeah. I hope not. I hope you're going to put together some technology that can help you identify what products am I bringing in my facility that may have additional restrictions coming them with these new exposure levels coming out by the EPA. So those are some of the big ones that I think that companies are facing, and they need to move away from paper and move to digital to help with addressing some of those challenges. And you
mentioned a good point here, like if you have staff that's potentially not or temporary or not always there or flexible, or they get fired or let go, where is that nexus of having the education there, or the site specific, employee specific knowledge of how to track this stuff? You mentioned some interesting things. Who knows what TSCA is at your facility? Do you have support that way? Not only that, is the software designed to find the right stuff, and are you training your folks to know what the red flags are, right? When you have company turnover, these people leave, you've lost that, now you have to start all over again. Management has to track that. It's a never-ending battle. And unfortunately, in the EHS world, we wear so many hats that now we are being left with, how are we ourselves going to get trained in the updated regulations? We have to convince our management, I have to attend this conference this coming year to get updated on the new TSCA trends. Are you going to let me go there, or do we risk being non-compliant? So, yeah, excellent point there. So the challenges are many. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that we've been siloed, EH&S professionals, specifically chemicals, and then therefore specifically hazardous materials professionals. I'm just going to set that aside and give it to the environmental people, right? So think about a procurement professional, and this is real story. Procurement professional, it's their job to go through whatever is coming into the facility and put it and give it to the right place, right? Orders come in, make sure you get it to the right place. Well, all the hazmat gets set aside. And then the hazmat person is supposed to come and be like, yep, I know what that is. I'll take it to the right place. If that hazmat person is not around for that week or whatever, they go on maternity or paternity leave, whatever. So this HR person was like, I know what this is. It says Fisher Scientific. So I'm going to just look in my Google Drive and I have acetone, which also says Fisher Scientific. So that's the right safety data sheet. And it actually was Fisher Scientific acetonitrile. Close enough to this person, this HR procurement person.
Sure.
But not the right safety data sheet. So that goes out into the facility with that safety data sheet. Unfortunately, someone comes back and says, no, this isn't quite right. And they're like, I didn't know. So I didn't know. So that to me is siloed thinking. And we need to put hazardous materials management up at the top tier of our facility management so that it's included across accounting, finance, HR, so that we're talking about those kind of things. We're already doing it with sustainability. That's come up to the top tier. So let's bring chemical management up to that top tier too and break down some of these silos.
Yeah, and I think that's actually very much in line with product stewardship, that whole concept, right? Bringing in all the responsible parties, the shareholders, the stakeholders within your organization, so with that we as the EHS person in that chain, in that gate along the process, is we need to not be seen as the stopgap or the person that's stopping me from producing. Like you always you hear about marketing saying, well, we want to bring this quote unquote green product in, but now I got to go talk to my EHS guy and I know he's going to put me through all the ringer of, is this what this means? You may want to avoid that, right? That silo that you talk about can be an inherent potential failure. And like you said, if I'm bringing a hazardous product in without having the knowledge, you want to give that person, going back to HazCom training, it's not always the end user of the product, but it's the purchaser, right? You go back to your marketing folks, you go back to your purchasing folks, you want to have them with some basic knowledge of what is a health hazard, what are things we're looking for that we don't want to bring in, or at least red flag before you purchase it. Otherwise, now you've got potentially a hazardous waste. Now that because it's rejected, Sarah came in and told purchasing, you can't buy that. Why did you buy that? Now I have to deal with hazardous waste, disposal of it. That could have been avoided had you spent maybe 10, 15 minutes of training ahead of time on what to look for when purchasing chemicals. But yes, very surely, and I think a future episode of Hack Your Hazcom will cover some product stewardship discussion points and what that means in this and a challenge that we can overcome.
Yeah, I think we should flip the script and I'll interview you about product stewardship. How's that? Because I think you have a handle on that and could give us a pretty good definition on that. I think that would be awesome.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, look for that in a future episode. So yes, so digging into the misuse or misunderstanding we have here. So you've said that SDSs have often been used for things they probably weren't designed to do. Can you give me some real world examples of where that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent a lot of time talking about this and talking about ingredients in safety data sheets and what those ingredients are intended for and how the manufacturers think that we're using that information and then how we're actually using that information out there in the real world in the field. And so manufacturers are looking at ingredients and saying, is this hazardous, right? Is this causing a human health hazard? And then they're applying the hazards and showing you that in the safety data sheet. But then in the real world, it goes out there and we start looking at that information for, hey, I need to do an air permit. And so I need to know how many VOCs total I have. So we're starting to segregate out. I bought 55 gallons of that product and 10% of it is a VOC. So now I'm going to calculate my VOC usage from that product. And I don't think the manufacturers ever intended for us to do that because they're not looking at it for exact totals. They're looking at it for a hazard. A lot of times sometimes these chemists are mixing these perfluoroalkyl substances and they don't know what PFAS is going to come out of there. So they just tell you it's a group of chemicals. I have a group of chemicals, and PFAS isn't one that always ends up on the safety data sheet, but they do give you like a chemical grouping and not a specific chemical name. So if you're looking at chromiums, or chromium compounds, which chromium compounds? Because if it's hexavalent chromium, now I have a respiratory issue that I need to look into, right? So they're just not giving us all of the information that we need. And the massively double-edged sword one is trying to use safety data sheet ingredients for supply chain information, right? And trying to discern whether or not, where that came from and the origin of that material that may have gone into something that you've received on site, and you're trying to determine, am I going to be able to continue to get that element in this safety data sheet? So there are a lot of things that appear. We try to use them for specific health assessments, yet there's things that don't show up on a safety data sheet that we maybe need to do a health assessment for. So maybe like an endocrine disruptor or a microplastic or a nanotechnology that isn't going to show up on a safety data sheet or may not show up on a safety data sheet. And therefore, we don't end up doing the correct health assessment for it. So where do we get that other information? That's where the experts come in and look at your process and your products that you're using to make sure that we are using other data and other documents to be able to do those health assessments and get down to the nitty gritty. And so what would that be? That would be like an industrial hygiene assessment, right? Air quality assessments using your continuous emissions monitoring to know your VOCs. So all of those extra pieces, and maybe you're combining information from the safety data sheet and doing those processes in order to get closer to an accurate total. But just relying on the safety data sheet and the ingredients for some of those things, I think is really risky. We need to remember that it's for hazard assessment, not all the other things that we try to square peg round hole with a safety data sheet.
Right. And that goes to why we have mandated by OSHA here in the US that's its own, I call them kingdoms, right? So you've got the OSHA kingdom, the EPA kingdom, the DOT transportation kingdom, and they don't like to talk to each other because they're their own royalty, right?
I love
they
that.
want to stay in
It's a
their
good analogy.
right? Yeah, good analogy, right? So that's why, what the whole reason we have an SDS in the first place is for workplace safety, right? My worker's safety, my end user. But when you start talking about air assessment or filling out Title V permits for my air permit or my FIFRA application for fungicide, pesticide use, these are outside of the scope. And you'll see in the regulations, the OSHA regulations will literally say these sections past Section 12 are optional, which is really crazy. If I'm from Europe and I see that, you're laughing at that because there's no such thing as optional in the
Right.
EU, right? So when you go in to get into those worlds where I got to fill out other, it's inventories for my Sarah Title III stuff, I have to now know what exactly is in my product. And I think you brought it up too, is the risk. Why should we be aware that it's probably risky to assume that you're going to get full transparency in your ingredient list. What do you find there in the challenge
Yeah,
as
that
far
is.
as getting that?
Yeah, I think
Go
it's
ahead.
along the same lines, right? Manufacturers are only putting in there the hazardous components, and there are products out there, chemicals out there that haven't been deemed hazardous per this kingdom, as you said. So it doesn't show up on the safety data sheet. And I think that the challenge that I see is that companies are hesitant, manufacturers are hesitant to give you full disclosure because they don't want to disclose trade secrets and they don't want to disclose intellectual property and lose their market share because of some secret formula. And it is absolutely their right to keep that formulation to themselves as long as they're sharing the hazards, right? So I think there is a group out there that is very protective of that. But fortunately, there are also other groups who are ready to embrace that transparency and that full material disclosure. So the two examples that come to mind for me, I don't know, are you familiar with the EPA's Safer Choice label?
I am. Yes, yes. Maybe explain that to our folks listening in.
Sure. The EPA has a program where if you're manufacturing consumer goods or household products, you can disclose all of the chemicals that go into that consumer good. And if the chemicals are not part of a restricted list and you've disclosed everything, then you're able to display on your product the safer choice label. And that just means to the consumer that the EPA has reviewed this product and it doesn't have any of those highly toxic chemicals in it. That's something that I always shop for. And the other one that's out there right now that comes to mind is the Health Product Declaration Collaboration. I think it's called that, HPDC. And it's really for construction and building and looking for buildings that are trying to get the LEEDs certification, the gold, silver, bronze certification for environmental transparency for buildings. Because people, constructions, architects, engineers were spending hours and hours looking for products that were less toxic. But this group decided that they would put together a website, you can check them out, and then a membership where you can access, and manufacturers readily agree to give all the information, all the transparency of everything that's in that product. And what that does for those companies is it opens them up to an entirely different market. The people that aren't disclosing are closing themselves up to that global market of companies that are looking for disclosure and transparency. So these safer choice products, as well as some of these HPDC products, they're breaking into a newer market that some of the other less transparent products or agencies or industries aren't breaking into yet.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, that, and I would imagine, like you said, that gives them probably a great competitive edge for those companies and consumers that are looking for the safer alternative. And especially with being more transparent, we want that in what we do, especially when you get into the kingdoms of report writing and report permitting and complying with permit requirements and all that good stuff that we need, that SDSs ideally could help us with. And, it starts with good transparency and at least the willingness. And I think you mentioned a little bit about that, the blind spots. And I think you mentioned earlier about ingredients maybe like PFAS that may not appear on an SDS. Do we know what companies should be doing to address those blind spots?
Yeah, I think that's another opportunity for a competitive advantage. We need to look forward a little bit. We are looking at like a transparent and material transparent economy. I think if you look towards global regulations, specifically in the EU, and they're looking at like the digital product passport, which we mentioned in the introduction, it is something that the EU has put together their Green New Deal program and their circularity program, where every product needs to have enough information on the label via a QR code that will tell you where did this product originate, what's its country of origin, what materials were used to make it, what do I do with it if I want to repair it, if it breaks, what to do with it if I want to recycle it, where can I take it? Tons of information focused on letting the consumer know what am I getting and what do I do with it when I'm done. And it's to start the circularity, but also it's really important and a major bonus for the chemical industry because we're going to get a lot of information there as well. So I think that organizations and large companies need to start thinking about those upcoming regulations. And yeah, that's in the EU. That it's called Project Sunrise, if you want to look it up. And it's supposedly starting in 2026. They're doing some pilot projects, starting with like lithium batteries and those kind of things. But they're focusing on industries that have the highest amount of wastage, which are things like textiles and then tires. And that just goes right into chemicals, agriculture, things like that. So because it's global, if you're a US company and you're selling to a global market, you're going to need to know about these upcoming regulations and you need to start preparing. And you need to start preparing your internal systems and your internal data to be able to be transparent and share this information in a way that consumers are beginning to expect.
That's great. And are you seeing more of that, like people, perhaps U.S. manufacturers, kind of showing that on their website, or where, if I'm going to find that as an end user or or a consumer of that material, could I do some homework ahead of time? You mentioned the database that's out there. Are you finding that companies are becoming more transparent, like we said earlier? If probably the more forward-thinking, circular-minded, sustainable type companies are looking for that, and maybe wanting to disclose ahead of time, providing a database. Are there examples of that out there that you see?
Yeah, couple that come to mind. I see mostly the big conglomerates that are doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Unilever, their products in the US may not have this digital product passport, but if you see some of their products in the EU, they actually are already putting those passports on some of their products. It's very common in the food industry, and we actually have some regulations in the US food industry that have forced the use of technology, not necessarily a digital product passport, but the ability to be able to report about the lot and batch number of food, so that if there is some sort of outbreak, they can easily track it back to where it was, where it started, so that we can let the consumers know that there's a problem with that product within 24 hours rather than two
Oh, wow.
weeks. So these technologies are already existing in pharmaceutical, medical, food. We're seeing it. We just haven't quite seen it to the US yet. The standard that is the most common that they're looking to adopt in the EU is for GS1. And you can go to GS1. They have a webinar, tons of conferences, and lots of information. And they're really setting that internal infrastructure for this technical database that all of us companies are going to have to figure out how to navigate. So that would be the first place that I would start, is for GS1. And then just start scanning some QR codes. When I go to the grocery store, I scan a lot of QR codes. A lot of them take me to the website, the 404 error page. Okay, they're trying, right? They tried to get this up and going. California has the eco label. So you'll see on like boxes of Wheat Thins and some of the bigger brands, you can scan the eco label and it will come back and give you all the nutrition information and some other information about that. So we're starting to see it. But now that if you've heard about this and you're looking at QR codes, yeah, we're still using QR codes to win a trip to Disneyland. That's fine too. But the next step for the QR code is going to be that, depending on what device you're using to scan a QR code and who you are, based on your profile for reading that QR code, you're going to get publicly available information. But you're inside the company and you're scanning a QR code, it's going to bring you to, with a specific device, it's going to bring you different information. And that's what's coming for us. So we need to be embracing some of these new technologies and just starting to learn about them, understand them, and be open to them, because it's going to happen fast. We're transitioning away from the paper and into this digital realm very quickly.
Yeah, especially since all of us now have devices in our pocket wherever we go. So
Yeah,
there should be no real excuse not to have the ability to access that data when and where you need it, right? So,
agreed.
you, yeah, excellent, excellent. So, you mentioned some of this with industry trends and looking forward. How is technology like AI or automation changing the way companies manage SDSs today?
How is it changing the way that they're managing safety data sheets today? So today, manufacturers are still sending PDFs, right, of safety data sheets. They're still sending them out via email. And then they
Maybe
come,
fax too, right?
oh, they
Fax
fax. I can't
machine.
even believe we're still faxing. But the information comes to the facility where it's being used, and it's really not useful in that format. So they're taking that paper and they're putting it through an optical character recognition tool or some sort of AI tool to segregate it. That's the best case scenario. Really, what's happening these days is that you can pay a service for $3 to $6 per safety data sheet to get that safety data sheet indexed. And what that means is just that someone is manually taking the information off of that safety data sheet and entering it into your safety data sheet management system for you. Typically, that's like a team of offshore individuals that are just putting in safety data sheets all the time. That's fine. However, data quality and data quantity are reduced because they're not usually putting in every field. And of course, there's going to be errors. That's what the game changer that AI can be, is that if if you're sending that off and you're waiting 24 hours for somebody to get that safety data sheet back to you, but you could use an AI parsing tool that would parse that safety data sheet for you. It makes mistakes in terms of where to put the data, but you got to check that and train your model. A lot of those are already out there and ready for you to use, but it happens in seconds. And then you get all the data. It's like a lot of times people are like, I didn't enter the transportation data. That happens to be the part I need today. I really do think that's the way that AI is going to change the way companies that are receiving safety data sheets are working. Companies that are creating safety data sheets, hopefully they have a software tool that's helping them enter in all of the information and then telling them what country they're sending it to and looking at those regulations and helping them through getting the right building blocks on their safety data sheet for whatever country they're sending that material to.
Great, great. And we're looking at that and hopefully more to come. And with the speed and entrance to the market, that AI will be here sooner rather than later. And hopefully that's being adopted. I think the world of EHS is maybe still a bit slow to adopt, but I'm seeing more and more out there, the possibilities. So
Yeah, I
good to
would
hear that.
agree. I would agree. Trying to get to that more streamlined, intelligent system rather than this manual process. We got a
Yeah,
little ways to go,
yeah,
but it will be nice once we're
right.
there.
Once we're there, exactly. How about a push in industry or in regulatory bodies or the sensibilities toward a broader chemical transparency beyond just hazard communication? What other trends are we seeing there?
Yeah, I think there are some global trends that are reshaping some of the expectations from companies. I think the biggest one we've touched on, which is transparency, but really what we're calling it is full material disclosure, right? So we are looking for companies to really put in all of the information that they're putting into a product, not just the hazard information. We want to know all of it. And we don't need to know the exact percentage. We need to know a range so that we can deal with that. But I think that before we see that as a federal or state regulation, you're going to start seeing it in contracts. And I think there already are contracts out there. So if you contract with maybe a large aerospace manufacturer and you want to know what chemicals are in the products you're buying, you can write it into your contract and be like, thou shalt disclose what's in there. And a lot of times that contractor will say, okay, we'll do that for X number of dollars, because it's expensive for them to do it because they have to go back down their supply chain and figure out what is the country of origin for this antimony that I put in my battery. So it's expensive for them to do that. But if they're contractually obligated, they will do that. And that's where I think we're going to start to see the beginning of the reshaping. And then once it's easy for manufacturers to understand their supply chain, then the transparency and the disclosure will follow. But right now, it's still tough for them to get that information out.
Yeah, especially when you're fighting that mentality that I don't want to disclose anything but just the bare minimum to get me to comply. That's it, right? And if you ask me beyond that, well, you're out of luck. So hopefully not the case. As we get with better contractual language and really probably more pressure from our users, right? With all these tools and being more transparent, you're hopefully going to want your manufacturers to think ahead of time to avoid that kind of mentality, right, in the future as we evolve. So that's a great point.
Yeah, I
I'm
think
glad you brought it up here.
consumers are going to demand it, and they're starting to. And like I said, I think we're going to see it first in pharmaceuticals and food safety, sustainability, those kind of places. And then as we're starting to see that and the tools start to mature and spread across different industries, hopefully we'll just start to see more and more of it, of transparency.
Great, great. And then speaking of tools, what tools or strategies do you recommend for companies that want to go beyond SDSs and really understand the chemical impacts of the products they use?
I'm going to start by saying what I typically see out there. I know it seems really basic and I've hit on it a little bit, but man, you have to know you have to know what's in your inventory, first of all, and you have to start treating these safety data sheets and your HazCom program as a proactive tool. not a reactive tool. It's something that you have to look into initially before you start using the product, before you start loading the tanker, before you start doing your industrial hygiene assessment, all those things before you start using the product, not as a reactive thing. I think
Right.
the other big advice is I would say stop using Excel spreadsheets for EH&S software. That's what I see a lot of is, oh yeah, I have my inventory. It's right here in this Excel spreadsheet. Hey, did you guys move this? Where is it saved? Oh, I think someone deleted this. This says February 2023. I know I updated it yesterday. So Excel is not the was never designed to be an EH&S software tool, so it's time to upgrade to a reliable chemical management system, and it's not that expensive anymore. It used to be per seat, per license, but now you can get a per month cost, and it's worth it because what you're really supporting there is employee retention, right? People want to work where they feel cared for and someone's looking after them. And when they know that you've done this research before you give them a product to use, they feel cared about and they feel taken care of and they're going to stay. And in today's world, that's important. It's hard to find talent these days. So just upgrade and take care of your employees and make sure they know what they're being exposed to.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think related to what I said earlier about having everyone walking around with a device in their pocket, that can be integrated and you can scan a barcode and automatically update your inventory, for example, right? That technology has been around for quite a while, but you're still finding three-ring binders out there of paper copies from the 90s, right? And SDS is not being updated. This is why we have, especially in the US, top five violations of OSHA citations.
Right?
Typically, if not number one, it's HAZCOM. Or the top five. It's in there every single year. And this is
Consistently.
typically, yeah, low-hanging fruit that you think could be fixed with maybe a technological solution. But at the very least, it's training, it's talking to your workforce, it's making sure that when new chemicals come in, you know that your inventory is being updated, your SDSs are being updated. You're training your folks on where to find that SDS, whether it's in electronic format or paper copy or on their phone. Is it accessible to them? These are all the things I think even if we could just see an incremental 10 to 20% improvement in just how we train our folks, this should get us to hopefully not having HAZCOM violations show up on the top 10 every year. I think that a world of difference. Then we could jump ahead to these electronic tools, these new ways of getting compliant that you're speaking of. That in my world, and the old Louis Armstrong, what a wonderful world this would be if we could just improve on the HAZCOM.
We have to be starting to sound like a broken record here. We really do, because this is something as hazard communications or certified hazardous materials managers. I feel like I've been saying this for 30 years, right? And I keep hearing back from industry, this is the way I've always done it, or I've never had a problem before. But that doesn't cut it anymore in today's new regulations with the new technology, with the new workforce. Everybody wants the Amazon, the Google experience, right? They want to be able to get that information right at their fingertips. And I don't know about you, but when someone asks me what I do for a living and I say I help companies manage chemical inventories and keep their employees safe, I would say once a week I get a story about, oh, I once worked for an epoxy flooring company and I fell in the flooring and I got a chemical burn on my arm. Or I once had to sweep the floor and there was dry acid on there and it got in my nostrils. Like, I swear every time, once a week, I get a new story about someone's whose life and health was impacted by the use of a hazardous material that they were unaware of. It's
Yeah,
2025. It's time to not have those stories, or at least reduce those stories. We've got a lot of
exactly.
tools, we got a lot of information.
Right, right. Well, great point. So, how about misconceptions you see out there with SDSs? Do you wish you could clear some of these up for every company you come across? What have you seen out there?
Misconceptions about hazard communication specifically?
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
like you mentioned, the five pillars of, there's so many
Yeah.
things we've talked about. We touched upon the violations, the things that, the stories you just said. Why are we
Yeah.
still having these violations? How do we get out of that mindset or misconceptions that you think we can improve upon?
People think hazard communication is difficult. They think chemicals are difficult. How many OSHA standards are there? 30, more than 30 OSHA standards. And if you're climbing a ladder, you know that the hazard is that you might fall, right? If you're working on electrical equipment, you know that the hazard is that you might get shocked, right? Or
Hmm. Hmm.
electrocuted. And chemicals are a little more quiet. And I like to say sometimes they're silent or they're violent, right? It's one of those two things.
Nice.
So
Yep.
I think that's the secret that we need to make not a secret anymore is that it's not hard. It's not complicated. The information is right there for you. It's a simple 5 step process, and that's just HAZCOM. But we can also, we touched on, and we probably got another episode here to do on chemical life cycle management. Like you talked about, like maybe that shouldn't have even come to you. Like maybe we shouldn't even have this on site. Who's reviewing what we bring on? Who's allowed to have this? In what process are we allowed to use that? And that's above and beyond hazard communication. That's chemical life cycle management. But just hazard communication is just the initial discussion about the hazards that you might have in your workplace. So I think that's the misconception. And I think that hazard communication needs to be done first. Everybody thinks of hazard communication as a piece of environmental health and safety. And I think that's flipped. And I actually learned that from the late Richard Cartwright. He introduced me to that
Oh,
concept. So I like to talk about this and talk about him a
sure.
little bit. He encouraged me to think of a certified hazardous materials manager starts the environmental health and safety process because they can look at something and be like, okay, milk. If you spill milk into a river, that's going to cause an environmental hazard. Is that hazard to me as a health? Nope. I don't have a problem with that. So the hazardous materials manager is the one that's creating the foundation for your environmental health and safety program. So I would like to encourage companies to look at your chemicals and your inventory and your HAZCOM first and then go from there. Let that be the foundation. You look at it and you're like, wow, respiratory hazard. Geez, do I need a respirator program? Oh, I don't know. Okay. Whatever it might be. Wow, this is flammable. What am I going to do? Do I need lockout? Do I need bonding and grounding for this? Am I pouring it? What am I doing? So I think it is very foundational. And so I'd like to encourage people to bring it to the forefront instead of pushing it to the side and being like, oh, chemicals, I don't really know how to do that. I'm going to put it over there. Bring it out to the front. It's not that hard.
Right. And one danger it is if you put it over there and let somebody else deal with it, well, that's where you have somebody getting exposed to something that they shouldn't have, or they didn't know, or why is it there, or oh, this is an interesting solvent which I've used and found this new great way to use it that never's been thought of before. And guess what? It's not on the SDS. Your downstream user doesn't know. The manufacturer never planned for it, and now you've got a new problem on your hands. So you can see where it's almost like a domino effect. If I'm not communicating, or if there's not somebody proactively looking at your inventory, look what other problems down the road that you can hit when the dominoes all fall down.
Absolutely. There's been a couple stories in the news lately here locally in Utah. I think it was about a year ago. They had a professor that was storing lots of chemicals in his basement. And they ended up calling in the EPA and they literally had to blow up the house because they were afraid to move some of the shock sensitive materials that had been stored in his house for so long. That is a pretty extreme example, but it happens in these laboratories where the professor comes and he starts his process and he's there for 20 years and is 10 years up. And then pretty soon someone's got to clean out his chemical lab, right? And we don't know what
Right.
it is
He
or
was a
how long it's
pack
been
rat,
there.
right?
The label's
Yeah,
fallen off,
right.
those scenarios, it happens. It happens all the time. So don't let that be you. Start up front.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So with that, if you could give one piece of advice to a business just starting to take chemical management seriously, what would it be?
Don't just set it and forget it. Don't just start get the inventory, write the program, do the training, and be like, we did it. I would say
Mm-hmm.
have an interactive process and get your employees involved. It's not a health and safety person's job. HAZCOM is everybody's job, right? I would say keep it open, keep it ongoing, and be open to feedback about it and infuse it with as much technology as you can because that's the easy button.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, back in the days when I was an EHS compliance person, the only EHS person at my industrial facility, union facility, well, I found the best thing that that we did was create a safety committee. That
Mm.
safety committee was made up of your line workers, and who better to know what issues they have than the line worker? I mean, I made it a point every day to not sit at my desk. I would go to the departments. I would talk to my safety committee folks and say, "Hey, how's it going? What's going on? Are you noticing anything weird?" Or, "Yeah, this container I'm using is kind of leaking," or, I'm noticing my equipment is not working right. Did you make a maintenance request? Did you do this? Or I may, sometimes quiz them. Hey, I'm holding this bottle of chemical. Show me the SDS for it. Where is it? And then they'd walk me to, at the time, the 3-ring binder and say, "Here's how I know it." And then I could quiz them right on the spot. Well, what does it do? What happens if it spills on me? This is a quick way to test them. They are now imparting that knowledge to the folks that are not on the safety committee team. The word spreads, right? And now I've got that safety culture there. That facility wound up becoming a VPP site. If you're familiar with the
I
voluntary
am.
protection
Yep.
program. Yeah, and so it's the mindset, and I fully believe that it's not just the EHS guy who's at the top of the mountain, kind of spewing down the commandments. It's not that way. It should be everyone's concern. Everyone should be able to, like I've told my colleague Bruce Donato, that his point is we want 10 working fingers, 10 working toes at the end of the
Yes.
day, right?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
that's I'm sure you've heard that too. So yeah, I'm a
Yeah.
firm believer in that. And, it's a simple thing, and it gets to that we should be a team working together in the facilities that we work with, the chemicals that we work around, the exposures that we get. So I think I wholeheartedly agree with your advice.
Rap sometimes, right? It's like
We
some of the
do.
facilities, when I go to do my inspections, I can hear them say, hey, move that drum to the flammable area before the safety lady gets here. And I'm like, safety lady's here. But then at the same time, those same people come to me with concerns and questions. Hey, the other day, right? And so when you're walking around, I've found, I don't know if you found, but you become a resource for them and they're no longer
Mhm.
scared of you. You're not going to
Yeah.
get them in trouble. They're starting to ask you questions. And that's
Right.
what you want.
Which is what you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly what you want. Because that's where you're going to find out that issues aren't being addressed, or they're being more proactive and they know they can come to you, that you're going to be their advisor and not the one with the carrot and the stick, beating them
Right.
over the head. Oh, I'm going to get a citation or a fine or whatever, and that's key to this. So with that, where can listeners learn more about these issues or follow your work on chemical management and sustainability?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. You can absolutely find me on LinkedIn. That's probably one of the best places. I try to stay up to date there. I do have a website. It's hendersonsolutions.eco, ECO. And as we mentioned at the beginning, I am writing a series of books. I'm trying to keep them small and informational. I got very discouraged about the 700-page book that I got through the first 20 pages of. So I'm trying to just create short volumes of informational health and safety books, which will probably be able to out on Amazon by the fall.
Fantastic. Well, great. And we'll have more of that detail on hackyourhazcom.com. So all those links that Sarah mentioned will be there. We are again very happy for you to join us today. Thank you so much for this great session, and we look forward to having you on at a later date.
Awesome. Thanks for having me,
All right.
Antonio. I really appreciate what you're doing. I think it's really important to share our knowledge out there. So
You're
thank you.
welcome. And yeah, I'd like to do my part in spreading, the joy of what we do. So thanks again for
People
being a
can also
part. That's right. So yes, we're both members of the Alliance of Materials Professionals, which puts on an annual summit So we bring professionals with cutting edge topics. I believe Sarah will be presenting there later on in the fall, September of 2025, as of today's air date. So we hope to see you there. And please do, if you want to learn more about the Alliance of Hazardous Materials Professionals, the website is the ahmp.net. So please look for more information there. And it's a good way to keep up on what we do in the EHS world. So thanks again.
That's big.